The message reaches Supreme Headquarters just after dawn. The reports filter into Supreme Headquarters just after dawn. The message is unmistakable. The Third Army is engaged and advancing. No authorization, no coordination, no approval from above. Eisenhower reads the intelligence twice. His jaw tightens. Somewhere east of the Moselle River, George Patton has forced a confrontation that was never cleared, committing thousands of men to a fight the Allied command has not sanctioned. Eisenhower picks up the telephone. It's already too late. If you're here for serious World War II storytelling, the kind that goes beyond the textbooks and into the moments where leadership, pressure, and consequence collide, subscribe to this channel. And after you've heard what Patton did, leave a comment. Was he right to give that order, or did he cross a line no general should cross? Now, let's examine what happened. This is not a story about heroism. It's not about a brilliant tactical maneuver that saved the day, nor is it about a disaster that destroyed an army. This is a story about a single order given by one of the most aggressive commanders in American military history that pushed the Allied chain of command to its breaking point. An order that Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower did not want given. An order he actively tried to restrain. An order that, once executed, could not be undone. George S. Patton Jr. was many things: a student of military history, a profane motivator of men, a battlefield tactician who believed in speed and violence of action above all else. But in the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward the German frontier, Patton became something else, a general at war with his own command. This is the story of that moment, not the legend, not the myth, the moment. By September 1944, the war in Europe had reached a crossroads. The Normandy breakout was complete. Paris had been liberated. American, British, and Canadian forces were racing across France faster than supply lines could sustain them. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was prioritized. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every replacement soldier had to be allocated with surgical precision. And George Patton hated every second of it. His Third Army had covered more ground in less time than any comparable force in the European theater. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the outskirts of Lorraine, Patton's columns had moved with relentless momentum. He believed deeply, fundamentally, that the war could be won by Christmas if the Allies maintained pressure, refused to slow down, and punched straight through to the Rhine and beyond. But Patton was not supreme commander. That role belonged to Dwight Eisenhower, a man whose entire command philosophy rested on coalition management, calculated risk, and the brutal mathematics of logistics. Eisenhower had to balance American ambitions with British concerns. He had to coordinate air support, supply deliveries, intelligence priorities, and political realities that reached all the way back to Washington and London. Eisenhower respected Patton. He valued Patton's aggression, his ability to inspire men to fight beyond exhaustion, his instinct for exploiting enemy weakness. But Eisenhower also knew that Patton was dangerous. Dangerous because he believed his own momentum could override strategic reality. Dangerous because he would bend orders, interpret guidance in the most favorable light, and occasionally ignore directives he considered cowardice disguised as caution. By mid-September, that tension had become impossible to ignore. Eisenhower had made a decision. The Allied advance would prioritize the northern thrust, led by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would drive toward the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, in what would become Operation Market Garden. It was a bold plan, a risky plan, but it was Eisenhower's plan. Patton's Third Army, meanwhile, was to consolidate positions, reduce its offensive tempo, and accept that supplies would be diverted north. Patton received that guidance with the kind of silence that precedes defiance. He had no intention of stopping. The Moselle River cuts through northeastern France like a natural fortress. Its banks rise steeply. Its waters run cold and fast. To the Germans defending the western approaches to their homeland, the Moselle was more than a geographic feature. It was a line that could be held, a line that had to be held. Patton saw it differently. To him, the Moselle was an obstacle, not a barrier. And obstacles were meant to be overcome through speed, aggression, and audacity. His forces had reached the river in early September, probing German defenses, looking for weak points. Reconnaissance patrols reported that enemy positions were thinly manned, that morale was fragile, that with enough pressure the line could break. But pressure required resources. It required fuel for tanks, ammunition for artillery, replacement troops for units that had been fighting non-stop since Normandy. And those resources were being funneled north to Montgomery. Patton's staff reported fuel shortages. Some tank units were immobilized. Infantry divisions were stretched thin. The supply situation was, by any objective measure, unsustainable for a major offensive operation. Patton didn't care. He had seen this before in North Africa, in Sicily, in the breakthrough at Avranches. Caution, he believed, was the enemy of victory. Logistics could be improvised. Fuel could be scrounged. Men could push further than anyone thought possible if they believed they were winning. And Patton believed they were winning. He also believed that Eisenhower was making a catastrophic mistake by slowing the Third Army's advance. In Patton's mind, the door to Germany was open. The German army was reeling. One hard, sustained push could collapse the entire Western Front and end the war before winter set in. But he had been told to wait. In late September, during a tense meeting with Eisenhower and other senior commanders, Patton argued his case. He presented intelligence reports. He pointed to maps showing German vulnerabilities. He emphasized that his men were ready, that the enemy was weak, that delay was more dangerous than risk. Eisenhower listened. He acknowledged Patton's points. And then he reaffirmed the decision. The Third Army would adopt a defensive posture. Limited operations only. No major offensives without explicit approval. Patton left that meeting in barely controlled fury, because George Patton had already decided what he was going to do. The exact phrasing of the order has been debated by historians, parsed by military analysts, and cited in countless studies of command authority. But the essence is clear. Patton didn't issue an order for open mutiny. Instead, he utilized a favorite tactic of the savvy, aggressive commander, the reconnaissance in force, and GT by ordering his divisions to probe enemy lines. He intentionally triggered a scale of combat that could not be easily broken off. He was creating a reality on the ground that the Maprumet chief could no longer ignore. He was betting that once American soldiers were across that river and fighting for their lives, the strategic calculus would have to change. This was not a reconnaissance mission. It was not a limited probe. It was a deliberate, coordinated assault involving multiple divisions, armor, artillery, and air support. It required significant resources that had been explicitly rationed by higher command. Patton knew it exceeded his authority. He knew it contradicted Eisenhower's guidance. But he also knew that once his forces were committed, once American soldiers were across that river and fighting, the strategic calculus would change. Eisenhower would not order a retreat. The Allied command would not pull forces back once they had gained ground. Patton was betting that momentum would justify defiance. He justified the order to himself and to his staff in simple terms. The opportunity was fleeting. The enemy was vulnerable. Hesitation would allow the Germans to reinforce their positions, fortify the river line, and turn what could be a breakthrough into a months-long slog. He was probably right about the opportunity. But that didn't make the order authorized. When subordinate commanders received the directive, some hesitated. They understood the supply situation. They understood the strategic priorities set by Supreme Headquarters. They asked for clarification. Patton's response was unambiguous. Move now. Questions later. Within hours, lead elements of the Third Army were preparing to cross the Moselle. Engineers assembled pontoon bridges under cover of darkness. Artillery units registered targets on the far bank. Infantry companies moved into assault positions, and at Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower's staff began receiving reports that Patton was doing exactly what he had been told not to do. Eisenhower did not respond with immediate fury. That was not his style. He read the reports carefully. He consulted with his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, a man known for his sharp mind and sharper temper. Smith was less diplomatic than Eisenhower. He understood what Patton was doing, and he understood the implications. If a subordinate general could simply ignore strategic guidance and launch unauthorized operations, the entire command structure became meaningless. Eisenhower's dilemma was acute. If he ordered Patton to halt the operation, to pull forces back from the Moselle, it would send a message to the Germans that the Allies were indecisive, that they could be pressured into reversing tactical gains. It would demoralize American troops who had fought to reach the river. And it would create a public spectacle if word got out that the Supreme Commander had to rein in one of his own generals. It would undermine confidence in Allied leadership. But if he allowed the operation to proceed, if he retroactively sanctioned what Patton had done, it would establish a precedent. Aggressive commanders could ignore orders if they believed they had a better plan. That was a recipe for chaos, for disasters born of uncoordinated offensives, overstretched supply lines, and commanders chasing glory instead of objectives. Eisenhower placed a call to Patton's headquarters. The conversation has never been fully documented. No transcript exists, but those who were present in Eisenhower's office described his tone as cold, controlled, and unmistakably furious. He did not shout. He did not need to. He told Patton that the operation had not been authorized, that resources committed to the Moselle crossing were resources taken from other critical sectors, that Patton's decision put Allied strategy at risk. Patton's response, as recounted by witnesses, was characteristically defiant. He argued that the operation was already underway, that his forces had secured bridgeheads, that pulling back now would be more costly than pushing forward. He was not apologizing, he was justifying. Eisenhower faced a choice: order an immediate halt and accept the consequences, or allow the operation to continue under the condition that Patton would receive no additional resources beyond what had already been allocated. He chose the latter, but he did not forget. Eisenhower made it clear that this was not approval, it was damage control. Patton had crossed a line, and while the immediate tactical situation might justify continuing the fight, the principle had been violated. In private, Eisenhower confided to his staff that Patton was both indispensable and intolerable, that the war needed men like Patton, aggressive, relentless, willing to take risks that more cautious commanders would avoid, but that the war also needed discipline, coordination, and a command structure that functioned under pressure. This moment tested that structure, and Eisenhower had chosen to contain the crisis rather than confront it fully. The Third Army's assault across the Moselle succeeded in establishing bridgeheads, but it did not produce the breakthrough Patton anticipated. German resistance, while initially disorganized, stiffened quickly. Reinforcements arrived faster than expected. The terrain on the eastern bank, hilly, heavily wooded, crisscrossed with defensive positions, favored the defenders. American forces gained ground, but it was measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. Casualties mounted. Supply shortages, already a concern before the operation began, became acute. Ammunition expenditures exceeded projections. Fuel for armor support ran critically low. Medical units struggled to evacuate wounded soldiers across makeshift river crossings under sporadic German artillery fire. Patton's argument had been that speed and aggression would compensate for limited resources. The battlefield reality proved more complicated. Some units performed brilliantly, adapting to shortages, maintaining pressure on German positions, and demonstrating the kind of tactical flexibility that defined the best of the American army. Other units stalled, unable to advance without the artillery support, air cover, and logistical backbone that had been diverted elsewhere. At Supreme Headquarters, staff officers tracked the operation with a mixture of professional concern and personal frustration. They had planned for a methodical advance. They had allocated resources based on strategic priorities, and now they were watching Patton's unauthorized offensive consume supplies that had been earmarked for other sectors. British commanders, already skeptical of American operational discipline, took note. Montgomery's staff circulated reports highlighting the Third Army's resource consumption and questioning whether American forces could be trusted to adhere to coalition strategy. This was not just a tactical issue, it was a political issue. Eisenhower found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending Patton's actions to Allied partners while privately expressing his anger at Patton's insubordination. He assured British leadership that the situation was under control, that Patton's operation was limited in scope, and that it would not interfere with broader strategic objectives. But the tension was undeniable. Within Patton's own command, reactions were mixed. Some officers admired their commander's boldness, his willingness to seize opportunity even when higher headquarters counseled restraint. Others worried that Patton's ambition was outpacing reality, that he was risking men's lives to prove a point. One staff officer, in a letter written weeks after the operation, described the mood at Third Army headquarters as "patriotic with confidence and anxiety in equal measure." Patton projected certainty. He spoke of breakthrough, of pursuit, of ending the war before winter. But behind the bravado, there was pressure to justify the unauthorized operation, pressure to deliver results that would vindicate his defiance, and pressure to prove that Eisenhower had been wrong to order restraint. While Patton's forces struggled to expand their bridgeheads on the Moselle, the war continued across the entire European theater. To the north, Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault intended to seize bridges across the Rhine and open a direct route into Germany's industrial heartland, had failed. The British 1st Airborne Division had been decimated at Arnhem. The operation that Eisenhower had prioritized, the operation for which Patton's Third Army had been asked to accept reduced resources, had not achieved its objectives. Patton saw the disaster at Arnhem as total vindication. In his mind, it proved that Montgomery's methodical planning was a failure and that his own aggressive, opportunistic approach was the only way forward. But where Patton saw a missed opportunity, Eisenhower saw a warning. The failure of Market Garden actually reinforced Ike's broad front strategy. To the Supreme Commander, Arnhem proved that a single, overextended thrust, no matter how bold, was dangerously vulnerable to a swift German counterstroke. The very momentum Patton was chasing at the Moselle was exactly what Eisenhower now feared most. Market Garden failed for many reasons: overambitious planning, poor intelligence, insufficient ground support, and stubborn German resistance. It was not a simple case of choosing the wrong axis of advance. And even if Patton's Moselle operation had been fully supported, there was no guarantee it would have produced the decisive breakthrough he envisioned. War is not a controlled experiment. Outcomes cannot be predicted with certainty, and commanders who claim that their plan would have succeeded if only they had been given more resources are engaging in a form of speculation that history cannot definitively answer. What is clear is that Eisenhower's decision to prioritize Market Garden had consequences, and Patton's decision to defy guidance and launch an unauthorized operation had consequences. Both men were trying to end the war. Both believed they understood the path to victory, but their visions were incompatible, and the friction between them shaped the course of the campaign. Eisenhower carried the weight of coalition command in a way few military leaders in history have experienced. He answered to political leaders in Washington and London who demanded results but often disagreed on strategy. He managed the egos and ambitions of subordinate commanders Patton, Montgomery, Bradley, and others, each of whom believed they had the answer to ending the war. He coordinated air, ground, and naval forces across multiple theaters, and he did all of this while knowing that every decision, every allocation of resources, every prioritization of one objective over another meant that men would live or die based on his judgment. Patton's unauthorized operation added another layer of stress. Eisenhower had to maintain discipline without destroying morale. He had to enforce command authority without alienating one of his most effective generals, and he had to do it while managing the political fallout with British allies who were already questioning American strategic coherence. In letters written during this period, Eisenhower expressed frustration with what he called the Patton problem. He admired Patton's results. He valued Patton's ability to inspire troops and drive relentless offensive action. But he also recognized that Patton's defiance set a dangerous example. If commanders felt empowered to ignore strategic guidance whenever they disagreed with it, the entire concept of unified command collapsed. Wars are not won by individual brilliance alone. They are won by coordinated effort, by synchronized operations across multiple fronts, by the unglamorous work of logistics, intelligence, and planning. Patton thrived in the chaos of combat. Eisenhower navigated the chaos of command. And in the autumn of 1944, those two forms of chaos collided. To understand Patton's decision, it's necessary to understand his philosophy of war. Patton believed that hesitation killed more soldiers than bold action. He believed that the enemy, once destabilized, should never be allowed to recover. He believed that war was fundamentally about willpower, that the side willing to endure more, risk more, and push harder would ultimately prevail. These beliefs were not arbitrary. They were rooted in Patton's study of military history, his experience in World War I, his observations of armored warfare in North Africa and Europe. He had seen what happened when armies paused to consolidate gains, when they allowed logistical concerns to override tactical opportunity. He had seen enemies regroup, defensive lines harden, and windows of opportunity close. From Patton's perspective, Eisenhower's caution was not prudent, it was dangerous. By ordering the Third Army to reduce its offensive tempo in September, Eisenhower was, in Patton's view, handing the Germans time they desperately needed. Time to bring up reinforcements, time to fortify river crossings, time to prepare defensive positions that would cost American lives to overcome. Patton genuinely believed that his unauthorized operation on the Moselle was not insubordination, it was necessity. He also believed that Eisenhower, sitting at Supreme Headquarters surrounded by staff officers and logistical reports, could not fully understand the fluid reality of the battlefield. Patton was there. He could see the enemy's weakness. He could feel the momentum. And he trusted his judgment more than he trusted directives issued from hundreds of miles away. This is not to say Patton was right. Belief in one's own judgment is essential for a combat commander. But it can also become a form of arrogance, a refusal to acknowledge that broader strategic considerations might outweigh immediate tactical opportunities. Patton never doubted himself. That confidence made him extraordinary. It also made him dangerous. The immediate consequences of Patton's Moselle operation were measurable. Bridgeheads established, casualties taken, resources consumed, command relationships strained. But the longer-term consequences were more subtle. Eisenhower never fully trusted Patton again. He continued to use him, to rely on his aggression and tactical skill, but he also watched him more closely. Directives to Patton became more explicit, less open to interpretation. Eisenhower's staff developed protocols to monitor Third Army operations and ensure that orders were being followed. Patton, for his part, never stopped believing he had been right. In his diary, in letters to his wife, in conversations with subordinates, he expressed frustration that the Allied High Command did not understand the opportunity that had been missed. He blamed Eisenhower's caution, Montgomery's influence, and the bureaucratic machinery of coalition warfare for prolonging the conflict. The relationship between the two men became defined by mutual dependency and mutual frustration. Eisenhower needed Patton's drive. Patton needed Eisenhower's authority to operate. But the trust that might have existed between them was replaced by something more transactional. This dynamic would persist for the rest of the war. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Patton would demonstrate his value once again, rapidly redeploying the Third Army to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. Eisenhower would rely on Patton's speed and aggression to stabilize the front. And once again, Patton would chafe at what he saw as unnecessary restrictions on his operations. The pattern was established. Patton would push. Eisenhower would restrain. And the war would be fought within the tension between those two imperatives. There is a temptation, particularly in histories written decades after the fact, to portray Patton as a visionary constrained by timid superiors. To argue that if only he had been given free rein, the war would have ended sooner, with fewer casualties, with a cleaner victory. This narrative is seductive. It fits the archetype of the bold commander unappreciated by bureaucratic leadership. It makes for compelling storytelling, but it oversimplifies reality. Aggressive command has limits. Those limits are defined by logistics, by the capacity of supply lines to sustain offensive operations, by the resilience of enemy forces, and by the political and strategic context in which military operations occur. Patton's operation on the Moselle did not end the war. It did not produce a breakthrough to the Rhine. It did not collapse German resistance. What it produced was a contested bridgehead, heavy casualties, strained resources, and friction within the Allied command. That does not mean Patton was wrong to attempt it, but it does mean that his certainty, his belief that aggression would overcome all obstacles was not borne out by events. Eisenhower's caution, meanwhile, was not cowardice. It was the product of a commander trying to balance competing demands, maintaining pressure on the enemy while preserving the structural integrity of the Allied coalition, pushing forward while ensuring that supply lines could support continued operations, taking risks while avoiding catastrophic failures. Neither man had perfect foresight. Both were operating in conditions of uncertainty, making decisions based on incomplete information and under immense pressure. The difference was that Eisenhower bore ultimate responsibility. Patton could advocate for bold action, knowing that if it failed, the consequences would be borne by the larger command structure. Eisenhower could not afford that luxury. One of the enduring questions from this episode is why Eisenhower did not relieve Patton of command. Patton had defied orders. He had launched an unauthorized operation. He had consumed resources that had been allocated elsewhere. And he had done so knowing that his actions contradicted strategic guidance from Supreme Headquarters. By any standard measure of military discipline, that should have been grounds for removal. But Eisenhower did not remove him. The reasons are complex. First, Patton was effective. Whatever his flaws, whatever his insubordination, he produced results on the battlefield. His ability to motivate troops, to drive offensive operations, to exploit enemy weaknesses was unmatched among American commanders in Europe. Replacing him would mean losing that capability at a critical moment in the war. Second, removing Patton would have created a political firestorm. Patton was beloved by his soldiers and admired by the American public. A high-profile relief of command would have raised questions about Allied leadership, undermined confidence in the conduct of the war, and potentially damaged morale across the entire theater. Third, Eisenhower understood that managing coalition warfare required flexibility. Commanders had to be allowed some degree of initiative, some latitude to adapt to changing conditions. If Eisenhower responded to every instance of aggressive interpretation of orders with punitive action, he would stifle the very qualities boldness, initiative, tactical creativity that made his commanders effective. But there was a cost to this flexibility. By choosing not to relieve Patton, Eisenhower sent a message. Defiance could be tolerated if results justified it. That message was not lost on other commanders, and it contributed to a command culture where aggressive generals felt empowered to push boundaries, to interpret orders in the most favorable light, and to gamble that success would excuse insubordination. Eisenhower managed this tension through careful oversight, through direct communication with subordinate commanders, and through the force of his own authority. But it was a constant balancing act, and the strain of it was evident in his correspondence and in the accounts of those who worked closely with him. War compresses time. Decisions that in peacetime might be deliberated over for weeks or months must be made in hours or minutes. The consequences of those decisions, lives saved or lost, ground gained or surrendered, strategic opportunities seized or missed unfold with brutal finality. George Patton gave an order in the autumn of 1944 that he believed would shorten the war. Dwight Eisenhower tried to restrain that order because he believed it risked the broader strategic campaign. Both men were acting on principle. Both were trying to win. The order was given. The operation proceeded. Men crossed the Moselle under fire, fought for bridgeheads, and paid the price of their commander's certainty. And when it was over, the war continued, not ended, not transformed, just continued. There are no clean lessons here. No simple judgments. Patton's aggression drove the Allied advance forward, but it also consumed resources, strained command relationships, and exposed his forces to risks that more cautious planning might have mitigated. Eisenhower's restraint preserved the coalition, maintained strategic coherence, and prevented the kind of disastrous overreach that could have collapsed the entire campaign. But it also frustrated commanders who saw opportunities slipping away, who believed that boldness was being sacrificed to bureaucracy. The tension between these approaches, between aggression and restraint, between tactical opportunity and strategic responsibility, is inherent to war. It cannot be resolved through doctrine or planning. It must be navigated, moment by moment, decision by decision, by leaders who bear the weight of consequence. What happened on the Moselle in the autumn of 1944 was not a clean triumph, nor a total disaster. It was the moment the Allied chain of command stretched to its absolute limit. It was the point where two incompatible visions of victory collided, and the cost was measured in blood and a permanent fracture in trust between the war's two most famous American leaders. The order was given. Eisenhower tried to stop it. The war went on. There are moments in war when leadership is tested not by the enemy, but by the weight of command itself. When the pressure to act and the necessity of restraint pull in opposite directions, when certainty and caution both seem like betrayals of the men who fight. George Patton believed in momentum, in seizing the moment, in refusing to let hesitation become a weapon in the enemy's hands. Dwight Eisenhower believed in coordination, in the unglamorous mathematics of logistics, in the responsibility of command that extends beyond the battlefield to the political, strategic, and human consequences of every decision. Neither man was wrong. Neither man was entirely right. And that, perhaps, is the most uncomfortable truth of all. The order Patton gave, the order Eisenhower tried to stop it, was not a simple story of heroism or folly. It was a story about the impossible choices leaders face when victory and catastrophe are separated by nothing more than judgment, timing, and the willingness to live with consequences that cannot be undone. The Moselle was crossed. The bridgeheads were held. The war was not ended, and two commanders, bound together by duty and divided by vision, carried